An anti-Trump host thought he could humiliate Barron Trump by asking a tough question about his mother. But what he didn't realize was that this moment wouldn't just backfire, it would mark the beginning of the end of his own career. The cameras are rolling. Millions are watching. Jonathan Keaton, sharp and confident, has made a career out of tearing people down. Tonight, he's ready to do it again. Across from him sits Barron Trump. Calm, quiet, unreadable. Keaton watches him closely, waiting for any sign of hesitation. He won't go easy on him. Not tonight. With a smirk, he leans in. The question is sharp, meant to put Barron on the spot. The audience holds its breath. And then, he makes his move. He had been waiting for this moment, the question that would put Barron Trump on the spot, the question that would get him to stumble. With a calm but deliberate tone, Keaton began, "Barron, your father built his presidency on deporting undocumented immigrants. But here's a question no one has dared to ask, shouldn't your mother have been deported too?" The question was a direct attack. It was meant to corner Barron, to force him into a position where he had no choice but to defend either his father's policies or admit a double standard. Keaton watched Barron carefully, his eyes never leaving him. He was sure this was the moment Barron would falter. The audience shifted in their seats, some gasped, others whispered among themselves. A few even chuckled, eager to see Barron's reaction. Keaton felt a smirk tug at the corner of his mouth. He had just set the perfect trap. Barron didn't flinch. He stayed calm, his expression steady, in sharp contrast to the growing tension in the room. Keaton had expected him to struggle, to become defensive or flustered, but instead, Barron's response was controlled, almost methodical. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, then spoke clearly, his voice steady. "Are you implying that legal immigrants should also be deported? Because that's what you just suggested." The question hung in the air. Keaton blinked, clearly thrown off. Barron wasn't taking the bait, wasn't scrambling for an answer. Instead, he was turning the question back on Keaton, making him the one who had to explain his words. Barron continued, explaining in simple terms. "My mother followed the legal process. She wasn't some exception to the rules. She went through the system, just like millions of other immigrants do. The policies my father enforced were aimed at illegal immigration, not people like my mother who came here legally." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before adding a final, subtle jab. "So, are you suggesting that all immigrants, even those who follow the law, should live in fear? That they should always wonder if they're next? That's a dangerous message to send on national television." The room shifted. The smug energy that had filled the space moments ago began to fade. What was meant to be a humiliating moment for Barron was now backfiring on Keaton. His words were being used against him, and Barron's calm, reasoned approach was leaving Keaton with no room to respond. Barron hadn't just avoided the trap, he'd turned the tables, and in doing so, he made Keaton's question look more like an attack on immigrants, legal or not, than a challenge to his father's policies. The tone in the room had changed, and Keaton could feel it. Barron had just made this moment his own. Keaton's confidence was slipping. He could feel the shift in the room, the way the energy was no longer in his favor. Barron had taken control of the conversation, and Keaton needed to take it back, fast. He forced a small chuckle, shaking his head as if Barron was missing the point. "So, you're saying your father's policies were perfect? That they never hurt real families?" It was a desperate pivot, an attempt to drag Barron into defending every single immigration policy his father had ever implemented. If Barron took the bait, Keaton could redirect the conversation, put him on the defensive, and regain control. But Barron didn't bite. He remained calm, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his words were measured, deliberate. "That's not what I said," Barron replied. "But let's be clear, there is a difference between legal and illegal immigration. My mother followed the legal process. Many others do as well. My father's policies focused on illegal immigration, and that's a distinction that often gets ignored in these discussions. Keaton shifted uncomfortably, but Barron wasn't done. And let's talk about how these conversations are framed, Barron continued. The media loves to create outrage, to spin narratives for political gain. People with similar backgrounds to my mother aren't questioned like this. You're not asking about them. You're only asking because my last name is Trump. The tension in the room grew heavier. Keaton could feel the weight of Barron's words settling over the audience. He was losing, and he knew it. So he went for a last-ditch personal attack. His voice hardened, his frustration slipping through. You've never struggled a day in your life, Barron. What could you possibly know about immigration hardship? The question was meant to be a final blow, a way to make Barron look privileged and out of touch. But Barron didn't react the way Keaton expected. He didn't flinch. He didn't look rattled. Instead, he delivered a response so sharp, so precise, that it silenced the entire room. Barron didn't rush to respond. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of Keaton's words settle over the room. Every eye was on him, waiting to see how he would react. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, measured, completely in control. So what you're saying is, I don't have the right to an opinion because of my last name? Keaton shifted in his seat. He hadn't expected that. That's interesting, Barron continued. Because I've noticed something, children of Democratic politicians are never asked to defend their parents. No one demands that they justify every decision, every policy, every controversy. But for some reason, I'm expected to answer for every single thing my father has ever done. The tension in the room thickened. Even some of Keaton's own supporters seemed unsure how to react. Barron wasn't finished. And let's be honest, this isn't journalism. This is performance. And you know it. That was it. The final blow. The studio fell into complete silence. Even the usual murmurs from the audience faded. Keaton, the man who had built his career on controlling the narrative, on asking the hard-hitting questions, suddenly had nothing to say. For the first time in the entire debate, he was the one on the defensive. The moment the debate ended, the real battle began, not on stage, but online. Within minutes, clips of Barron Trump's response flooded social media. Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube exploded with discussions, debates, and reactions. It wasn't just about the exchange itself, it was about what it represented. The response was immediate and polarizing. Right-wing media seized the moment, praising Barron for his composure under pressure. Headlines read: Barron Trump destroys liberal journalist on live TV. Calm and unshaken, Barron Trump schools the media. Political commentators called it a turning point, comparing Barron's ability to handle tough questions to his father's past debates. Some even speculated whether Barron had a future in politics. Left-wing media scrambled to reframe the narrative. Instead of focusing on what Barron actually said, they questioned whether his response was rehearsed, calling it a scripted PR move. Was this a carefully staged political moment? Did Barron Trump train for this interview? They argued that Barron had simply dodged the real questions, shifting the focus away from immigration policies. Others claimed Keaton had been set up, that the debate had been unfairly slanted. Neutral analysts took a different approach, acknowledging that the real takeaway wasn't about Trump or his policies, but about media bias and how political families are treated. One viral post summed it up perfectly. If Barron's last name weren't Trump, would this even be a conversation? Social media was on fire. The hashtags #BarronClapsBack, #KeatonExposed, and #MediaBias trended worldwide. Conservatives flooded the internet with praise, calling Barron's calm demeanor a sign of strength. This kid just handled himself better than most politicians. They thought they could break him. Instead, he flipped the script. Even those who weren't Trump supporters admitted they had gained respect for Barron. Liberals scrambled to downplay the moment, insisting that Keaton had still won the debate or that Barron had simply avoided answering the real questions. But their arguments didn't gain traction as quickly. Some even turned on Keaton, questioning why he had engaged in personal attacks instead of sticking to policy discussion. Meme culture took over. Keaton's stunned face, captured in a still from the debate, became an instant reaction image. Captions ranged from "When you realize you just lost the argument you started," to the brutally simple "Checkmate." Edits of Barron drinking water, smirking, or sitting calmly while Keaton fumbled were everywhere. TikTok was flooded with remixes, dramatic music, and side-by-side comparisons to past viral debate moments. Keaton's silence. Perhaps the most telling reaction came from Keaton himself. Normally active on Twitter after major interviews, he went silent. No posts, no explanations. He declined invitations to appear on morning news shows, letting his network's PR team do the damage control. But the damage had already been done. This was no longer just a debate. It was a cultural moment, one that Keaton had no control over. The fallout wasn't just online, it bled into mainstream media, and Jonathan Keaton knew he had to do damage control. The next day, he appeared on his own network, looking noticeably less confident than he had the night before. His usual sharp tone was still there, but the arrogance was gone. He wasn't controlling the narrative anymore. He was trying to salvage it. Sitting in the same studio where he had confidently gone after Barron Trump just hours earlier, Keaton now found himself explaining, justifying, backpedaling. He blamed the way the debate had been received on out-of-context clips and bad faith interpretations. But the real focus of his defense was the claim that Barron's response had been scripted, rehearsed, a carefully managed PR stunt. "Look, I've been doing this for years," Keaton said, trying to regain his composure. "And I know a pre-rehearsed answer when I hear one." That wasn't a spontaneous response, that was a well-prepared media strategy. The real question is, who coached him? The statement was meant to cast doubt, to take attention away from the fact that Barron had handled himself better than Keaton had expected. But it didn't have the effect he was hoping for. Instead of shifting public perception in his favor, it only made things worse. Independent journalists call him out. It wasn't just conservative outlets that pushed back, it was independent journalists, neutral commentators, even some of Keaton's own colleagues who saw the flaw in his argument. One journalist from an unaffiliated media watchdog group posted a brutal response online. "You asked a question. He answered. You just didn't like what he said." It spread fast. The narrative Keaton was trying to build wasn't sticking. Instead of making Barron look like a scripted political figure, it made Keaton look bitter, unprofessional, and unable to accept that he had been outplayed. Another commentator put it even more bluntly on a morning radio show. "If Keaton had won that exchange, we wouldn't be having this conversation." But he didn't. So now he's trying to spin it as unfair. It's weak. Some of his colleagues, while not outright denouncing him, admitted privately that he had overplayed his hand. One even went as far as to say, "Keaton went in thinking this was an easy win. He underestimated Barron, and now he's paying for it." Keaton had built his career on his ability to take control of the conversation, to make his opponent stumble, to create viral moments where he was always the one with the upper hand. But now, his own credibility was in question. For the first time, people were asking. Was he being fair in his interviews? Had he built his reputation more on personal attacks than actual journalism? Was this moment exposing a deeper bias in political media? These weren't the conversations he wanted people to be having. Meanwhile, Barron stays silent. As Keaton scrambled to explain himself, Barron did nothing. No statements, no interviews, no follow-ups. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than anything Keaton could say. And that, more than anything, was what made this moment even more powerful. The debate was supposed to be a test, a moment where Barron Trump would either struggle under pressure or confirm what critics had long believed, that he was nothing more than the quiet, privileged son of a controversial former president. Instead, it became something else entirely. By the next morning, his name was trending worldwide. But for the first time, it wasn't just because of his father. This time, Barron Trump was being discussed for his own actions, his own words, and his own presence. The conversation had shifted. Political analysts, journalists, and social commentators all weighed in. Was this just a one-time moment, or had something more significant happened? Some dismissed it as a fleeting viral clip, a lucky debate moment. But others weren't so sure. Barron Trump just proved he can handle the heat. And he did it better than some seasoned politicians. This wasn't just a young man defending his family name. This was a public figure being born in real time. Like him or not, Barron Trump just walked into the political spotlight, and he didn't blink. Speculation begins: is Barron a future political player? The debate had barely ended before political strategists and media insiders started asking the bigger question. Is Barron Trump going to step into politics? Some saw him as a potential rising star, someone who could follow in the footsteps of his older siblings, Ivanka and Don Jr. Others believed this moment was accidental, a rare instance where he had been forced to respond, but not something he intended to repeat. Debate panels and talk shows ran with the idea. Is Barron Trump a new political force? Could he be the future of the Trump legacy? Did we just see the moment where Barron Trump stepped out of his father's shadow? Some conservative commentators even floated the idea of him running for office one day, calling him the next evolution of the Trump brand. Barron's silence makes it more powerful. But while the media speculated and politicians debated, Barron himself did nothing. No statements. No interviews. No victory laps. He didn't post about it. He didn't respond to news articles. He simply moved on, letting the moment exist on its own. And that, more than anything, made the impact even stronger. By refusing to engage, he showed control, not just over the debate, but over the narrative that followed. He wasn't playing into the hype. He wasn't rushing to capitalize on the attention. He was letting people draw their own conclusions. And in a world where political figures constantly seek the spotlight, Barron's choice to step back only made the moment feel more real. Whether he wanted it or not, this debate had changed how people saw him. It wasn't just about his last name anymore. It was about him. The debate may be over, but the conversation is just beginning. And that brings us to the real question. Should children of political leaders be judged by their last name, or by their own words and actions? It's easy to assume we know someone just because of their family. But does a last name define a person? Does it erase their ability to think, to grow, to be their own individual? Or is it time to start looking beyond the headlines, beyond the assumptions, and actually listen? What do you think? Let's continue the conversation.